Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great honor to be here. What an amazing series of achievements for a 20-year-old. I mean, congratulations. So today, it's a day of celebration for you, but it is also, I suspect, a day of reflection, because you will be going out to find work, or to start a business, or perhaps to go back to your old jobs, in an environment which is the most difficult economic environment we have seen for many, many years. It is a cliché, of course, that in a crisis there are opportunities. And that is a cliché that I will repeat today. But before that, let me give you another, even more obvious cliché. In the crisis, there are difficulties and there are dangers. Now, in the course of your study at ALBA, you have learned about the key factors of success for a business and how it will be gobbled up by competitors if it does not build those factors. You will have learned about opportunities and threats. The literature and the case studies have been very useful, I'm sure. But maybe you have not had time in the classroom to discuss some of the threats that are most important in Greece today, and also in countries like Greece. I mean, other countries with weak institutions from which some of today's graduates originate. Neither, perhaps, have you discussed some of the opportunities that arise specifically in such countries, especially in the crisis. So before you go back into the dangerous and exciting world of real business, here are a few words of advice. First, study the laws and regulations of your business. Take time to understand both the letter of the law and the practice of bureaucracy. In countries like ours, regulations and bureaucracy matter immensely. Indeed, this will be the single most important type of obstacle you will have to overcome. There will be civil servants who will be obstructive, or will give you contradictory interpretations of the regulations. Or you may have a clever business plan to cut out the middleman, because middlemen add a lot of cost to the supply chain. But you will discover at the very last moment that there is an obscure engyclios, a circular, which forbids you from doing that. Or you will set up an e-shop to sell beautiful designer sandals to customers in Russia or in the US. And you will discover then that for every single package, let's say valued at 200 euro that you send over, you need to pay 90 euro to clear Greek customs. Otherwise, you will need to pay VAT, which your Italian competitor will not have to pay. Or you will discover that the civil liability of a corporation can abruptly become a criminal liability for its directors, and so on and so forth. You need to understand all that before you venture too much into new territory, or before you invest heavily in fixed assets, and definitely before you take on any debt. Understand, but do not be deterred. So here is my second piece of advice. Do not let yourself get sucked in by bureaucracy. I know entrepreneurs who try to tackle tax and ICA and planning permits all by themselves. This is wrong. If you're a natural salesman or an engineer or a leader, it will be a waste of your time and your talent to be dealing with bureaucracy. And you will not have the energy left for your customers and for your product. Find a good lawyer and a good accountant and outsource all that. We have not produced much in Greece in the past 30 years, but we have produced a lot of lawyers and a lot of accountants. Many will be willing to help small companies for low fees in the hope that they'll be important clients when they grow. Talk to a few of them and try them out. Your primary criterion for selecting an advisor should not be the low fee, and it should not be the grand name. It should be practical expertise. I know some of you have taken classes in organization design where you have learned that a good team needs different sorts of people, entrepreneurs, administrators, producers, etc. Well, Add bureaucracy specialists to that list. Now, third, as your business grows, your strategy for dealing with bureaucracy must change. When it is just you, or maybe a couple of partners, normally you will be below the radar screen. There's not much to worry about. When you become a small employer, or if you join a small employer, the risks increase, and the costs of compliance are very high in proportion to the size of the business. That is when many choose to evade taxes or to flout regulations. If you want to build a proper and long-lasting business, I advise against that. Not because you will get caught, you can probably get away with that in this country, but because the business cannot grow, it cannot build quality assets, it cannot attract real talent, and it cannot endure if it's based on breaking laws. So you must have different strategies for minimizing the cost of compliance while staying within the law. Outsourcing is one of those, and my next bit of advice will address that. But let me point out that if you have a big company, bureaucracy costs proportionately less, and your worries shift to actual operating costs, including labor, at this stage. And at this stage, formal organization and systems do matter. And the company should invest in those, not only for productive efficiency, but because they also make compliance and dealing with bureaucrats much easier. So, fourth, if you have a small business, trust can be your most important asset. You will need to outsource, but you will also need to make sure that your providers are reliable and excellent. You cannot afford to buy their loyalty by paying high prices or by buying great quantities, so you must have another way to keep them engaged. That other way is trust. Now, that may be standard advice in business courses, but in chaotic and low-trust societies like Greece, most businesses do not put in much effort into building trust. The ones who do, however, stand out, and they stand to gain. A very successful and wise ship owner once asked me to help him to manage a business which depended from buying produce from small farmers. The first thing he told me was this: when you tell somebody he will be paid on the 20th of the month, pay him on the 18th. It is better to negotiate a longer payment date and pay earlier than to miss your deadline. We did this, and it did wonders for keeping our suppliers through difficult times. And as a venture capital investor, I can tell you that nothing destroys trust between investor and entrepreneur more than a surprise, a bad surprise. For example, if a young company struggles to fulfill a big contract and is in danger of losing a key customer, the investor should know this immediately, as soon as the entrepreneur knows. If the investor walks into the regular meeting 2 weeks later and the entrepreneur casually says, by the way, we lost Vodafone, that will be the end of trust. Good investors expect that new companies will have difficulties, but they also expect to know the full extent and soon. That way they can work with the entrepreneur to overcome the problems. If not, they will try to cut their losses and exit as soon as possible. So remember your basic economics: a scarce commodity commands a higher return. In Greece, trust is a scarce commodity, so those who own it can profit from it. Or, as George Burns used to say about acting, honesty is the most important thing in an actor. If you can fake that, you can fake anything. But I do mean it. Being honest with your partners is sometimes painful. Being reliable in paying your suppliers may add to your financing costs, but believe me, it pays back. Item number 5. Now is the time for the cliché about the crisis being an opportunity. The greatest underutilized asset in Greece are the skills and ambitions of the self-employed. If you have a chance, try to observe the following type of people. Small farmers in Corinthia who grow the finest white seedless grapes in the world to the highest specifications of British supermarkets. teachers in Frontisteria who devise their own teaching methods to ensure their pupils do well in exams for university entrance or for foreign language certificates. Doctors who follow the latest developments in medicine on their own initiative and in their own time. Taxi drivers who have discovered via TaxiLead, you may know that they can build their own plan, their own brand of politeness and service and cleanliness through that. Tour guides who weave enchanting narratives of history and archaeology in Delphi and in Epidaurus. In every occupation, you will find people like that. They are self-employed, and they acquire skills and tacit knowledge by their own drive and ingenuity. They value the quality of their work not only for the money, but also for their own sense of self-esteem. If you can tap into their skills and ambitions, you can build great businesses around that. But you may ask, if this is such a great asset, why don't we already have successful companies based on such skills? So here's my point number 6. The crisis has shifted the incentives for these talented people. Before 2009, most of them, or rather most of us, I should say, could make a decent living in the domestic market. And the domestic market was regulated in immediate ways by the state, so there was little incentive to innovate. And in many occupations, one could have a comfortable income just by being there. This has now changed, both because domestic demand will remain depressed for many years, and because old regulations are being lifted. Doctors, for example, of whom we have too many, cannot hope to make as much money as they used to out of prescriptions or diagnostics in the local market. On the other hand, they may have new opportunities to be partners or employees in medical service companies that are established by investors. Such companies were not permitted until very recently. So they can now try to build offerings for the global medical market in what is called medical tourism. Greek governments and companies and individuals have already invested heavily in hospital buildings and in equipment and in medical education. So we have the fixed assets and the human capital that we need to become a major destination in medical tourism. What we did not have up to now were the incentives, the enabling legal framework, and the systems. Investors and business people can now organize the systems and mobilize the doctors. I do hope we shall witness the birth of some global leaders in this field in the next few years. My 7th and last tip is this. There are great opportunities in the combination of cultures. You know the 3 basic competitive strategies. One is to compete in the global market by building leading-edge technologies. Another is to replicate what Western factories do, but at lower cost. And the third, of course, is by differentiating your offering. This is the only international strategy, the strategy of differentiation, that can work for most Greek businesses. But a differentiated offering cannot be created just out of the ingenuity of one entrepreneur. She or he will need to build either on special local materials or on the special skills of the people around them. And this is where local culture becomes important. Greece is rather strange for a European country. We thrive by bending rules. We prefer the small scale. We value our independence over being part of a stable hierarchy. We invest a lot more in education than is economically rational. And we mix business with private life, both in the layout of our cities and in the use of our time. Now, these are the preconditions for a special type of creativity. The problem is that these Greek skills cannot be sold globally in their raw form. Somebody must uncover their value, must package the offering, must create useful services out of this chaos. That someone can only be an entrepreneur who understands both worlds. That of the remote client, who may be a consumer in the US or a company in India, and that of the undisciplined but motivated Greek provider. I'm not going to give you examples of business models here, but I hope many of you will discover your own. So, this was my short list of business tips for this time of crisis and change. It is a difficult time, but you can be sure of one thing: all crises come to an end. In the case of Greece, what will happen when the economy starts growing again is that 1 million new jobs eventually will be created. It is not going to be people going back to their old jobs. It will involve professionals and young people moving into sectors that have been neglected over the past 30 years. The so-called tradables, which are exposed to global competition. Agriculture, specialty foods, light manufacturing, design-intensive artifacts, professional services for the global market, technology. So who is going to take the initiative to plan these new businesses? Who will be both visionary and serious enough to attract capital for the businesses? Well, nobody, I'm afraid, except for you people in this room. Thank you.